For our next session, we have an exciting dialogue with Connie Woon, Erica Miners, and Sabina Vaught on abolition in education. Sabina Vaught is professor and director of the Kinloch Commons for Critical Pedagogy and Leadership at the University of Pittsburgh. Sabina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris, for making the introduction and kicking us off. If you're just joining us, many thanks to Elon Dancy, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Urban Education, for the vision and the labor that you put into creating this extraordinary gathering every year. And thanks for inviting me to be in dialogue with my colleagues today. Thanks to Fantasy and her team for getting us together and making this fabulous. And many thanks in advance to the ASL interpreters, Derek and Jared, everyone on tech support, Emily Thurston, who will be monitoring the YouTube and Zoom chats to get everyone's questions, and everyone else who's made this possible, accessible, and very meaningful. So now, welcome to my brilliant comrades and dear friends, Dr. Erica Miners and Dr. Connie Woon, for our panel, Freedom Now, a dialogue on abolition and education. Connie is a co-founder and executive director of AAPI Women Lead. She's committed to ending racial and gender violence at all levels through education, research, organizing, healing, wellness, and community defense. She has worked as a sex worker, university and high school educator, and anti-sexual assault counselor. She's published across mainstream and academic presses and has been on national and local media. Her most recent publication is Abolition for the People with Colin Kaepernick and Christopher Petrella. And we published something together too, Connie. You, me, and Damien. And Connie's abundantly generous, I should say, invited me and Damien to participate in a project, and we got to write something up on that. Connie has thankfully left academia and is continuously working toward freedom. After 23 years of practicing yoga, she's a certified yoga instructor who loves the art of Muay Thai and kickboxing. So please join me in welcoming Connie. Erica, writer, educator, and organizer. Erica's current books include For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State, a co-edited anthology, The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Toward Freedom, the co-authored Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence, and the co-authored Abolition, Feminism Now, from which we drew part of the title for today's dialogue. A distinguished visiting scholar at a range of universities and centers, including Humboldt, Trent, CUNY Grad Center, the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, and Chicago's Leather Archives and Museum, Erica has published articles in a wide range of publications, including In These Times, Social Text, Radical Teacher, Women's Studies Quarterly, The Advocate, and Boston Review. Erica's work has been recognized by awards, including the 2015 Henry Trueba Award from the American Educational Research Association, a 2016 Soros Justice Fellowship, and other support from the Illinois Humanities Council, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Education. The Bernard J. Brummel Distinguished Research Professor at Northeastern Illinois University, Erica is a member of her labor union, University Professionals of Illinois. Erica teaches classes in education, gender and sexuality studies, and justice studies. Most importantly, Erica has collaboratively started and works alongside others in a range of ongoing mobilizations for liberation, particularly movements that involve access to free public education for all, including people during and after incarceration and other queer abolitionist struggles. A member of Critical Resistance, the Illinois Death in Custody Project, the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Education Project, and the Education for Liberation Network. Erica is a sci-fi fan, an avid runner, and a lover of bees and cats. So please join me in welcoming Erica. Erica and Connie and I will talk through some big questions for a bit and then open up for participant questions. As I mentioned, Emily Thurston, who is a doctoral student in the urban education program at the University of Pittsburgh, will be sending me questions directly during the Q&A period, but feel free to submit them earlier. We just won't see them until we get to that point in the conversation. So this forum, CUESEF, is designed for educators, broadly conceived. And so I wonder if Connie and Erica, you would start by sharing with participants on the webinar in some detail what educational movements, efforts, and organizations you're currently part of and have been part of. And part two, in those experiences and in those movements or organizations, what have you seen as central to effective educational work for freedom? Connie, why don't we start with you?
It's funny, I was going to say, Erica, let's start with you. But, you know, of course, first, thank you, Sabina, the team, Fantasy, Emily, for putting this on, Dr. Elon for inviting us to come and speak. And Erica, it's always so good to see you. I'm so excited to be on this thing with you. And thank you, Derek, for being a part of our team today. All right. So a couple of things. One is the question, where did we come from? How did we begin this journey? What movements are we a part of, right? So I, technically speaking, I'll say that I've been a part of prison abolitionist work since the 1990s, before it was trendy, I'll have to say. And I was a part of some of the youth organizers at Critical Resistance in 1998 in Berkeley, California, and then subsequently a part of different other abolitionist organizations, including as a board member of the Prison Activist Resource Center, which was also based here in the Bay Area. And again, this was before it was anything close to trendy. In fact, we had surreptitious meetings and clandestine meetings, and we were afraid we were going to get in trouble. But that was the origins of the work back when I was still 19 years old. And since then, I've been a part of Color Violence, which is an anti-gender violence organization, which also started in the 1990s, early 2000s. And since then, I've worked as a GED tutor in San Quentin prison. And I say these things because they were not necessarily a part of today's abolitionist movements, but I do want to name that we existed in the 90s. And I do want to say that we studied very closely with political prisoners and learned quite a bit from political prisoners, both who were currently incarcerated at the time, who had just been let out at the time. I still even remember the day that we all saw Geronimo Pratt come out, and he was, back home or free again, in scare quotes, right? So that's been a part of my work for a very long time. And then I became a school teacher with this framework in mind and this political organizing history. And that was very challenging to be a school teacher during that time. And then I began learning even more so through collective study groups with a friend named Dylan Rodriguez, Frank Wilderson. I name these things because I think them to be educational efforts. I think them to be educational movements, and they were definitely anti-state. So they were not formally integrated into state institutions. They were not nonprofits. We were either collective study groups studying at cafes, or we were just outside in the streets. And I think that's really important because we studied religiously. And we studied religiously, knowing that the educational systems that we were formerly a part of were a part of the problem that we were experiencing. And so what's central to effective educational work is to do the work outside of the state, if at all possible, and always against the state. So what needs to happen is a conceptualization of what the state is. Right? Because sometimes when I talk to people, the concept of the state is quite narrow. They'll just name certain institutions. Maybe they'll name Trump, right? And somehow they'll forget the state is also everything else, including the Democrats, right? And so I just want to name that what's central to that is organizing outside of the state and against the state. And what also I think is very central to effective, or I don't know if it's effective, but it's central to freedom work, is to really think through the idea and the reality that we exist under warfare. And I think about that, and we'll be in dialogue a little bit more, but I want to name that. I've been thinking about that a lot more since I've left academia, and since I've been in the trenches elsewhere, how multi-pronged the warfare strategy is here in the United States, and how much so many of us are under siege. And there are multiple tentacles by which this is happening. And I think what's central to perhaps being effective, or at least surviving and even considering gaining power under warfare, is going to take multiple strategies, knowing that warfare is what we're living under. And I'll pass that to you all. Feel free to tell me what to do as well.
That's fantastic. Why don't we hand it to you, Erica, and then come back as a group.
I also just want to say I'm super excited to be here with the two of you, just valued comrades. I like that C word, comrade. And I also want to have deep gratitude for all the community that made this event possible. And I just want to also acknowledge the powerful morning. I caught part of the panel with Dr. Roberts moderating mother activists. And I just want to acknowledge their immense labor and vision, and the just really beautiful memories and moving memories they shared of their loved ones this morning. I just want to sort of keep that in the room while we're talking today, and just have gratitude for that. And I love this question about community and what kind of groups you're a part of. I feel like not unlike, sort of Connie was flagging a joy about being, her bio was flagging the joy about being out of the academy for 23 years. And I think something that I've learned from Connie and from Sabina and so many others is the power of collectivity and the power of networks, groups, communities, to give us opportunities to learn and unlearn. Of course, books have changed my life, but also more importantly, participating in campaigns, projects, organizations, networks. Those are places and spaces where I have learned and moved and changed, and I continue to be part of that work. And those movements are feminist, they're intersectional feminists. When I use the word feminist, I'm calling it in an intersectional feminist framework. Those movements are populated with artists, with workers, and most of the networks, organizations, and projects that I've been lucky to be a part of, the study and struggle work is instigated often by women of color, queer women as well. So I just want to lift up those as some themes or threads within some of the groups that I'm participating and have participated in. I also have been connected to Critical Resistance, a national anti-prison organization. I think I met Sabina at a coffee shop at one maybe 15 years ago, or at a planning meeting. I feel like things get fuzzy now that I'm older about what days and what years. So I've been attached to that network for many, many years. participating in local chapters, but also participating in political education, the sub-working groups, and also sort of the work of the organization. I've been part of other networks like the Education for Liberation Network that works with folks, young people and folks more broadly around education. And that network puts on a biannual, every other year, Free Minds, Free People convening, and also does great kind of plan books for radical educators. I've been part of other groups. I've been part of a group called the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project for about 15 years, which is working, inside and outside to maximum security prisons in the state of Illinois. So do all kinds of different work related to that. I'm also a union worker, and I think that's particularly important to flag today in this conversation around with educators as well. I'm a member both of the University Professionals of Illinois, and I see that as a strong part of my identity. And I'm also a fan and a supporter of the Chicago Teachers Union, which has been really pushing for a different kind of model of union labor across the country at this moment, especially for K-12 folks. So I feel like this is a bit of a shopping list of kinds of things that I've been involved in, but I want to come back to that point that I made at the beginning, that I feel like all of these movements, whether it's my own labor union, whether it's being a fan of other labor unions, whether it's my longtime connections to organizations like Critical Resistance or the Education for Liberation Network, or some of the more pop-up groups. I was thinking, while Connie was talking, a bunch of us organized and formed this Teachers Against Militarized Education team. Also, I think it was maybe in the late 90s. In part because the Chicago public schools were being taken over by the Department of Defense. The Chicago public schools. The mayor of the city was turning over local public schools to be run by the Department of Defense. And we formed this organization, and artists made these great buttons and signs, and we would show up and try to both do political education work in communities, and also just raise the visibility of this sort of bankrupt public policy decision that the city was making to turn over middle schools and high schools to branches of the Department of Defense in Chicago. So a team, that was great. We had this little hot pink button with a tank with a pencil being jammed in it. So that was a pop-up, kind of organization that I've often been part of, groups of people that are pulling together organizations in moments to respond to either political necessity, as Connie was talking about, the framework of warfare. And then it really does feel like we need strategic mobilizations to be visible, to be organized, to be tactical, to respond to some of these forms of deep harm and violence that are targeting parts of our communities. So I just want to, so some of the things that I've learned from this work, or why I feel like it's important to be involved in networks and communities and groups, is that it, gets us to practice collectivity beyond the state, or beyond sort of the formal ways in which we're often schooled to think about community. And I think for me, it has offered, incredible pathways to learn and unlearn, some of the, foundational tenets of the United States, for example, white supremacist, capitalist, ableist, heteropatriarchy, that it's working in community, that I've really, tried to challenge some of those ideologies, to build the freedom work, to also practice, right? Connie used the word abolition in our conversation today. Is about abolition, is about building, worlds outside of the endless policing, caging, borders. And it's being in, running a community in the summer of, I think it was 2002, where we practiced safety labs. We formed ways to intervene, when someone in our loved one in our community was experiencing interpersonal violence. If we don't call the cops, then what do we do? So I offer just these as, as some examples of some projects that I'm involved in and I'm connected to, and I'll turn it back to you, Sabina.
So I knew this would happen, and I'm going to blame the two of you. You're so brilliant. You've got me going off script already. So you both talked about, excuse me, war, the state, sort of the processes and excuse me, tactics, but I think you also alluded to the ways in which these are sort of both immediately tangible and material and hard to define. So I'm wondering if we might think, particularly for classroom teachers on this call, if we might think about how can they begin to think about what is the state? How can they begin to understand actually what are the wars, maybe plural? And I think, Connie, you said, well, people say the state and they say Trump. And I think it is confusing in some ways because the state gets confused with government. So what are those capacities that are the state, those sort of structures and ideologies? And then how do different governments take those up? And if we think, oh, well, if we get rid of DeSantis, then, Florida will be fine, doesn't really get us to the state. It just looks at a particular regime in the moment. And I'm wondering if that would be helpful to thinking about warfare as well, given that the warfare might feel like it's enacted or undertaken by regimes like DeSantis's regime, but there are state structures that make that possible that maybe get hidden or are confusing to see, particularly when people are working in a state institution, a massive state institution. So I'm wondering if the two of you would just think open-endedly. It doesn't have to be comprehensive or conclusive, but how can educators start to ask this question? What is the state? Where do I see it? What does it look like? How is it different from government? And how does that help me understand the warfare that's occurring? And either of you, feel free to jump in.
I was going to punt to Connie for that one, but I was also like, oh, I could hear Sabina even more on that. But do you want to start us off, Connie? I feel like I was just talking a mile a minute before.
I think we can just all three of us do it. And I'll be transparent that I was excited to be a part of this conversation so that I could think these things out more thoroughly, albeit with an audience. So, and we rarely get chances for the three of us to chat. So here it is. I'm going to answer the question not directly, right? I am going to say that we have to name the structures of violence that we are operating under, by which the state makes possible. So we can name the structures in the same, I think that, and this is my offering, right, in my reading, Erica names these forces of violence. So I'll add to them. When I say the structures, I mean we are living under and through structures of violence, including anti-Blackness, if not namely anti-Blackness, right? Anti-Blackness structures this world ever since modern civilization, right? We can name white supremacy as a part of the structure. We can name anti-queer cis heteronormativity as a part of the violent structures. We can name misogyny. We can name anti-poor, working class, anti-indigeneity, right, as the structure, right? A colleague of mine and a mentor, for better for worse, Frank Wilderson, used to say that this is a chessboard, right? And I take that chessboard analogy quite seriously to say that the chessboard is the structure by which we are the pieces on it, right? So if we name those structures and we agree that those are the structures of the air that we breathe, right? Then the state is an apparatus, if not the main apparatus, that makes these structures possible. And I name these structures as structures of violence. So the state includes government institutions. the state is made possible through educational institutions. The state is made possible through other agencies, including, if not importantly, educational institutions. So when we're talking to educators, and me having been one of them, and all of us on this call being a part of it, we are all agents of the state, right? Dorothy Roberts talks about, Dorothy Roberts talks about the child welfare system, right? That is also an arm of the state. So these are arms of the state, right? But then we also have relationships that make these structures possible, that also operate and rely on the state. And that's how good the state is, right? The state makes you compulsory, right? See Sabina's book, Compulsory Schooling. Like, it makes us reliant upon it. It gives us no other options, right? Given even Erica's work, when not even, but especially when Erica was saying these prisons, these options, we're not going to call the police. Who do we call? They've taken every option outside of the state. That's how you know it is a unidirectional form of warfare. You have no option out. And even if we try to do guerrilla warfare, right? Like, how? Because they're everywhere, right? Not only are these the state institutions, we're talking about the relationships that deeply rely on these institutions, that find their joy and their pleasures in these institutions, right? And in the cultures by which these institutions like proliferate, right? So when we go to like our sports stadiums, everybody is standing up for the flag, and then you get booed if you're the only person sitting down. Like, how dare you, silently object to the state and the empire and the structures by which they are cheering, and their livelihoods and their joy is coming from, right? So I think we have to name these institutions, these structures, and the relationships, and even the I said relationships, but I think the I'm trying to code switch and make it like our libidinal, like our desires, right, are also a part of these structures, right? Our impulse to punish particular bodies, right, are also conveyed and made possible by the state and the structures by which we were all made possible here. So I say to the teachers and the educators and ourselves, like, what roles do we play as their state agents? Are we there to diversify the state agencies of so much harm, or are we in there to destroy it? So you have to ask yourself those critical and very practical questions that Sabina started with. What's the practical role of you? Your practical role is to ask, are you an agent, or are you here to destroy it? And if you are here to destroy it, how are you going to do it? And how far along are you going to go? And who's coming with you? Right? That's all. I've been thinking about this for a minute too. Oh, by the way, Miriam Kaba just cited you, Erica, in her what's it called? Her newsletter, and your definition of the carceral state today. So I just thought about that. I might have been referencing that too, by the way.
Oh, and also just want to say it's so great to be in conversation. And like Connie, I was like, oh, we can use this as a working session to get a little crisper. I mean, I feel like I've been going down like an anarchy side road the last, couple of years, and I'm kind of excited about that. But I think this question, just to build on, Connie's brilliance, I'm here just as an example. I'm here in Illinois, which is a Democratic supermajority state, and our governor just passed a ban on book bans, right? Saying that we can have no book bans. So in some ways, in some sense, one might look at our governance structure and say it's sort of like a good governance structure, that we have like a good, but we still, there's still kind of Connie's point, there's still deep kind of embedded. I really like, you know, the sort of libidinal energy that you brought to that conversation as well, Connie, as not a sidebar, as a serious point. I think really important. There's still kind of work to be done, even in a state where we might say, you know, we just elected, you know, Brandon Johnson, a mayor who's you know, kind of you know, one of our people from the Chicago Teachers Union. But, you know, 40% of the city's operating budget in Chicago is still spent on policing. You know, we still have a $33 million contract for Chicago Public Schools to put police in schools. And even if we did win, which we have a long campaign to remove police from schools in Chicago and CPS, to remove CPD from that, you know, that's not we still have the work to do to challenge that white supremacist, capitalist, ableist, heteropatriarchy that is sort of built into the framework of how we think about public schooling, right? You know, we were just referencing, you know, Dr. Roberts, you know, who's reminding us that, you know, if we get cops out of school, then are we going to have, you know, social workers doing the work of policing? So this attention to, you know, I think that state, you know, I think, you know, state making and statecraft is something that, you know, or, you know, a different, like slightly, you know, related version of that commenting, we're making publics, right? But we're also the entities that are doing that. And we are, you know, fraught, flawed people shaped by all of those deep ideological tensions. So how do we undo those? How do we undo that work at the same time, you know, as we are, you know, trying to, you know, flourish in our communities. So I really appreciate that push to kind of distinguish between the two, sort of governance and state. And I'm struggling with, you know, because I work at a public university and I work at you know, I'm the product of, I'm from Canada originally. I'm the product of having, you know, almost free public secondary, post-secondary education and free healthcare, not free dental care as a child. And I think that those forms of statecraft are life-giving, right? But they also, you know, so I think that can seduce you to thinking that the state can be a good entity. It can be a good, you know, a good framework, but it's also that same, you know, state creates, you know, communities all across Canada that have no access to potable water, you know, primarily Indigenous communities. So I think trying to think critically about where we're located, you know, what kind of work we're being asked to do. And I think that's particularly critical for those of us who are educators who are trying to, you know, do some work, you know, at the site of the public school or the public university. I think really key. I'd love to hear more from you, Sabina, before we go to the next question. I know it's probably going off script, but maybe like a little bit.
Very fair. Well, as I'm listening to you, I'm wondering if censorship is an example that might help educators ask some of the questions you've framed. So, Connie, I loved when you said, "Are you there to diversify or destroy?" And I think there's this example. So Illinois might be seen as a place that's protecting people against censorship, and Florida might be seen as a place that's rabidly censorious. And yet both places are illustrating the same function of the state, which is, you know, if states in part are, I understand them to be designed to carve up the world, to create territories, and to organize antagonistic relationships and asymmetrical relationships among people in those territories, and that they emerge through racial capitalism and colonization. Well, then censorship is this deep structure of the state which says we always have to have groups of people to protect from and against each other. So Illinois will protect people from bans, and Florida will protect people from knowledge and freedom. And both are the governments are drawing from the same deep structure. So if we want to fight against that sort of warcraft on people, the creating of those violent antagonisms, then educators might think about, well, actually, what's the deep structure of censorship in the state, what nation state, and how can we fight locally, but also fight that the state has this sort of regulatory and organizational power over groups of people, and that we might be, as teachers, mediating that, liberalizing that, reforming that, or destroying that. So I wonder if that example gets at what you all were saying, or if you want to push back on it or change it a little bit.
No, I like that example, but I also want to lean into sort of the both and there, that there's a materiality, you know, of being in Florida or being an educator in Florida or Illinois, that might, you know, that those policies or those differences might make a tiny material difference in the day to day. But I think what you are, which I think is both like a little bit seductive, but and also real at the same time. It's like I'm not going to have this kind of surveillance or this kind of threat in Illinois, for example. But I think what, you know, so that's sort of the both end, and you know that you know might distract us from kind of asking these larger, harder questions that are you know, as imperative to kind of lay on the table. So how do we hold both of those in that kind of moment in tension? That yeah, if I'm a teacher working in, you know, in Chicago, I might have a lot more protection to support, you know, trans young people and their families and communities. But at the same time, you know, what's the sort of trade-off, or what's the cost, or what's the deeper work that I can, you know, that I need to be doing so I can do that both and, right? So I can do the work in the immediate, in the now, but also I'm thinking kind of longer term or structurally, or how to build movements and communities and ways of thinking. So this is not the this is not the kind of condition that we're in 5-10 years from now, where the state, you know, without sounding like a Star Trek conspiracy, has the power to kind of make these decisions for us. So I appreciate that as an example.
I think a quick add is, you know, the way that you kind of named Illinois, not kind of, but you named Illinois somewhat as like a safe harbor, in scare quotes, right, against this right-wing, ultra right-wing conservative culture and warfare that we're experiencing. I don't take for granted that safe harbors, however flimsy they may be, exist, right? And I think that is also in part what Erica was talking about. Like, there is a need, largely because it's so violent, right? If we name it as warfare, we have to have, like, you know, and I'm not making an analogy when I say we need the bunkers, we need the trenches, we need bodies who are the direct targets of the warfare. We need a place for them to retreat. We need a safe place for them, right? So in large part, to talk to the educators again, like, what role are you playing when you're able to identify who the targets of this warfare are, right? What role are you playing in that? Are you one of the people for whom this warfare is really geared towards destroying or utilizing or extracting from? Are you an object of this warfare, right? And or what role are you going to play in taking care of those and fighting alongside or protecting those for whom are the direct targets if you are not one, right? And I think that's really important, because we are not equally subject to the warfare, right? We are not all, it's not like democratic warfare, right? Like, it's very targeted. And I think that doesn't, and what that means though, is that there are endless casualties. What is genius about warfare here is that it seems to only be symbolic, right? It seems to be an analogous warfare. When we talk about it, we don't think of it in the terms that we see that is sensationalized on television, But in fact, it actually is happening in Chicago, in Oakland, in Oklahoma, in Pittsburgh, in Philadelphia, in all of these places, all of the time, particularly against Black people, Indigenous people, Brown people, queer people, right? And then we see it happening in these ways that are through educational warfare, right? Through the curriculum. And so I want to name that there is a need for these safe harbors and that they are important, but they are temporary. When the war seems to be atemporal, right? Unless abolition comes into fruition.
Mm. And remote, like inaccessible to people. So Illinois is a long walk from Tampa. So you're making me think too about how, you know, sort of when you mention places, you're making me think about the ways in which geography is a very purposeful sort of implement of warcraft. Yeah. Thank you all for going off script a little bit there. It does seem like this is sort of a nice segue into thinking with each other about how you're currently conceptualizing abolition. And you're both very, very experienced abolitionists, and you've written, you've built, you've collaborated across sort of countless anti-carceral efforts. And you've alluded to a conceptualization, but I do think it would be exciting and meaningful for people on the call, particularly people who maybe, you know, Connie, you kind of gestured toward it becoming trendy. They've heard it over and over, but maybe not heard, like, what is this actually? What is it conceptually? So I wonder if you might take a minute to think about that with people on the call, and to think about it broadly, but also in the context of education.
I'd like to learn from Erica first, please.
Oh my gosh, I'm loving this. I feel like, you know, maybe I'm just like old school, and I also have been, when I first came to abolition thinking from a convening in Illinois, downstate Illinois. I love how the state that I currently reside in now, it has like a place in this call, in this conversation, which is a little daunting to me, because we certainly are no, you know, we're not a state, we're anyway, I don't want to go down that road again, but it's not a haven, right? So I want to push that, right, a little bit. So I first came to abolition from a convening with critical resistance organizers, downstate Illinois, probably, I don't know, I think it was probably 20 years ago, maybe a little bit less than 20 years ago. And I have been doing related kind of prison justice work. And I had loaded up a car full of people and drove downstate Illinois and heard people from CR talking. And, you know, they offered a working definition at that time about the prison industrial complex, right? And I think that term is a really important term to kind of remind us of this moment, a prison industrial complex, the interwoven system, you know, of punishment, surveillance, dispossession, violence, right, that has unfolded, right, in the United States and globally, and that CR really offered for me a definition of abolition, kind of building on decades of the Black radical tradition of how do we, you know, how do we build, how do we dismantle, how do we change, you know, to build a world that is, you know, more safe, right, more free, more just, you know, for all people in it, right? So how do we shrink our reliance on policing? How do we end our reliance on prisons? How do we end our reliance on borders and demarcation, and challenge dispossession? So I feel like for me that original definition of abolition that I came to through working from CR still stays with me and still is an important. And I find myself in conversations now where people identify as abolitionists, and I have to say, for me, it's not necessarily an identity, but a practice that I'm still trying to to do every day. Trying a practice of a way of working, a way of thinking, a methodology, a politic, and not an identity, or not like something to to kind of describe oneself as. And I also feel like it's important, I find myself sometimes having to specify, you're in a room and people identify as abolitionists, and abolitionists of all kinds of things, of the university, and abolitionists of the, I was at a panel recently, people were talking about abolishing the family, which I wasn't against, right? But I was also like, then I felt like, I might need to like specify here that I'm actually, my thinking and my organizing and my practice is coming from work that's connected to the abolition of the prison industrial complex, right? So I think that doesn't preclude other kinds of work, but that's how I feel like I'm still kind of in that framework, and I still feel like I have learning and work and thinking to do in that framework with other people, and I feel like for educators, to think about oneself as a prison industrial complex abolitionist, right, means, thinking about how to build worlds that, are free of gender and sexual violence, right? How to think about how to collectivize at your work site, how to think not just about removing the police from schools, but also what's the underlying work that we have outsourced to policing, right, in schools. What are they being asked to do? Because it's no use, just, defunding the police in our schools if we're going to bring in social workers to do that exact same work, right? For me, being an anti-prison industrial complex abolitionist connected to schools also means thinking about, teaching and learning and curriculum, and also kind of, coming back to our earlier discussion about what's the deep work. I mean, schools are all about meritocracy, right? They're all about sorting and sifting, right? How do we think in sort of fugitive or radical ways to kind of support different kinds of relationalities within an institution that is predicated on best, mediocre, and worst, or failure and success, right? How do we promote teaching and learning, ourselves, our communities that are kind of away from the kind of the superstructure or the logic that's really built into schooling. So those are just some of the kinds of things that I'm thinking about, and some of the ways in which I am reminding myself about what abolition, because I do think it's a bit of a tricky moment, where more people are identifying with that work. But I also just want to push, then it's a moment, right? If the movement to defund police, if the movement to end our reliance on borders, if the movement to stop the endless flow of people, and I just want to echo Connie's point that it's not democratic or arbitrary who's targeted for policing, who's targeted for incarceration, right? If we see ourselves as part of that movement, I would really encourage people to read, to study, to form communities, to pay attention to the kind of the history of that struggle, because it may appear that it just sparked after the murder of Mike Brown in Ferguson, or the murder of Breonna Taylor, right? But there's long kind of histories to those demands and to that movements, to the movements of communities, particularly Black folks, particularly folks that could never rely on the state, right? Like undocumented communities, like queer and trans communities, like sex workers, right? That those movements have been those communities and groups have been at the forefront for decades, right? Of figuring out how to be safe, how to support one another. We call it mutual aid now, how to live, right? That is not relying on prisons and policing. So it might appear that it's a newer movement, but it has long, rich, deep history. So I think the move now is also, in my book, there's never any moment that doesn't require more study. Of course, always struggle, but more study. So I think that this is a great moment for those of us in schools to form reading groups, right? Think about, reading some of the early work around abolitionist organizing. I think that's a really profound way to kind of, for those of us who might be a little bit newer to the work.
Erica, thank you for reminding us the central focus of the prison industrial complex. I think I really appreciate that, because as you've named it, I'm fine with people wanting to abolish everything, but I am mostly interested in people understanding very clearly what it is that they are trying to abolish and their relationship to one another. And I say that because as someone who, learned from critical resistance and I was 19 years old, the things that I studied were Leonard Peltier's writings, right? Who was still incarcerated. Mumia Abu-Jamal, who's still incarcerated. Assata Shakur, who is, has a bounty on her still, right? I name these people in part because they're three of many political prisoners for whom I would say were central to a lot of our thinking in the 90s when we were beginning to popularize the idea of abolishing the prison industrial complex. And I think those roots are very important because what they were naming and the main reasons why they were incarcerated was because of anti-Blackness, was because of anti-indigeneity, and was namely because they were freedom fighters fighting against anti-Black regimes, including, if not namely, the police, the military, right? I think that's important because prison is one of the main arms by which the freedom fighters I just named were being punished. And prisons are what needed to be abolished because our freedom fighters were being punished through them. And policing was to be abolished because those were the forces of violence that were part of the warfare against Black people, Indigenous people, and other communities, marginalized communities, but namely Black and Indigenous communities. And I think that's very, very, very important to continue to name when we think about abolition, because I think it has become, and I'm glad that it's become, more it's become a part of mainstream discourse. But what has not become a part of mainstream discourse is the roots of freedom fighting within there, right? And what they were fighting, what we have been fighting against. I think that's really important. I say that because through your work, Erica, and Sabina's work, I have been thinking a lot more, when I was in grad school, you two were the books that I read and the articles I read around the school prison nexus. And I think it's still very, very brilliant, relevant, and if not the name of what we are fighting against as well, right? How did schools and prisons coexist and co-create one another? Because Damien Sojourner's work, who is not with us, but is a dear friend of ours, talks about, the first forms of anti-Black policing happening at the school sites against Black liberation movements. So we have to go back again and name, what were the prisons for? What is policing against? And it was often, if not often, it is foundationally anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-worker, and I'm only naming a couple of things, right? Anti-queer, right? So I think that's important for us to think through when we are conceptualizing abolition. Abolition means to destroy the institutions or to not undo, but to, I'll just say, to destroy the institutions that make this place uninhabitable. And I think, and we have to name why it's uninhabitable, not just because we feel like it. Right? And if you have a feeling and an intuition around it, I'd like for you to dig in and find the root of that intuition. And hopefully it's because you recognize that the state agencies have been so oppressive and violent that you'd like to abolish those institutions and those forms of relating, right? So that's something that I've been thinking about. I've also been thinking a lot about the ways, and I think Sabina and I have talked about this, what has, and Erica, you mentioned this too. I'm starting to see people just say, hey, my name is so-and-so and I'm an abolitionist. And I'm like, I didn't know that it was an adjective, right? Versus like a lifelong project. And I think that's important, not because I'm against you identifying as such, but I'll mention it again. It takes a lot of collective study, and what you're asking for is almost the end of the world. So I think the concept of abolition needs to be taken very seriously. Otherwise, what we're noticing is people use that concept so that they can get book deals, so that they can get funding, so that they can get credibility, so they can get dates, right? Which is fine if you're finding your community. But I'd love for us to come back to the origins. Are you ready for the warfare that comes with it? And are you actually participating? Or did it become a part of your LinkedIn profile? So that's where I think we are with abolition. That's what I'm hoping that we can push against and further when people are now thinking about abolition, right? Are you ready for the warfare? Because I would like for us to be. I'm not against it. I mean, we need a lot of people. So just be ready and do the training for it. I think that's key too. Like if we're fighting a war, I need us to come for the training. I can't have you coming in just guns a-blazing and just shooting the wrong people. You know what I mean? Or whatever it is. Anyways, and I actually don't mean that metaphorically either. I actually mean that very literally. So I don't know if that addressed the abolition question.
Yeah, beautifully. I mean, both of you. And I think what I hear across what both of you said, you said a lot that was fantastic. And I was taking notes, but one of the sort of common practices or sensibilities was study and what it means to study. So on the one hand, I think, there can be this sense that study isn't action, right? Study is somehow indulgent or bourgeois, but that study actually is the core action to collective learning, building, growing, doing. And that I also heard you both say that it's lifelong. We don't sort of study and then arrive at some sort of knowing and then have an identity, but that there's collective study that always is pushing us through relationships and is both the action and the preparation for the action. Did I kind of connect that? Yes. Okay. So if we're thinking about study that way and thinking about it as radical action and as collective, I'd love to get into your work a little bit, you all's scholarship and writing and speaking, and think a little bit with people on this call about the specificities of your work. I was gonna, and you all, their work is just abundant and rich, and I encourage you to, you could have a Connie one and Erica Miner's study group and it would last like 5 years and it would be fabulous. So dig in. But as a starting point to dig in, I wanted to ask you, Erica, to think with us a little bit about your recent co-authored text with Angela Davis, Gina Dent, and Beth Ritchie, entitled Abolition Feminism Now. And the question can be open. I don't want to determine what you want to share, and that also may have changed based on the wanderings of our dialogue. But I would love, if you're wanting to hear the ways in which you all thought about this insistence on thinking and acting globally, and the sort of importance and impulse of moving away from a US-centric abolition as, you know, a form of imperialism, so that there can be, you know, Trio talks about there can be critical imperialisms, right? Just because it's critical or radical doesn't mean it doesn't become imperial. I thought you all wrote beautifully, and I'm wondering if you would sort of think through that and how you all were thinking about that centrality.
Oh, thank you for that. It's so awkward when you write something, and I'm somebody who has always, I like writing. I like writing with other people because it's often an opportunity to think through problems or to be in relation to people. I mean, my day job is at a public university, and universities are often deeply individualizing, isolating, highly, alienating places for many of us. So the opportunity to think in conversation with people is something that has always been like a lifeline for me. And I include you too in that work, in that community of like co-thinkers. So thanks for the kind words. But the awkward thing when you write something is you think it should speak for itself, and then you have to go and talk about what you wrote on top of it, right? So just a little follow-up there. But I think that we wrote that in part, we started before the pandemic, and the four of us have been in overlapping communities for decades, and we felt that we were constantly showing up to abolitionist spaces and asking the question, how do we center also the work to end gender and sexual violence in our work to challenge policing, in our work to, challenge borders, right? And similarly, showing up in feminist spaces, and in the work to end forms of interpersonal violence. How are we also ending, racism, ending white supremacy, ending gender and sexual violence? How are we also working to challenge policing and not turning to the state as the response, to gender and sexual violence, for example, because we know that it is not the response. So those felt like persistent kind of conversations, even though the work of Connie for many years has been to sort of fuse that, to point to the fact that you can't be abolitionist without being feminist. You can't be feminist, really, in our definition of feminism, without being abolitionist. So we had started in fits and starts to kind of, do that work. And for us, an internationalist lens was crucial. And I think in some ways the project fails, because, we were trying to avoid what a comrade called sort of the flora and fauna approach of, internationalism. Like, we're just going to be able to, mention something and just kind of, have like a tourism approach. So most of the organizations that we tried to name in the project were organizations that we had relationships or connections to, or some sort of connection, or we knew the work. And I think that felt really important because, the United States is certainly not, the project of the United States, the harm of the United States is not a central, it's not something we wanted to anchor the project in. We wanted to be able to point to this work as flourishing and not bound by borders. And to also, I think that's particularly important for people who live and reside in the United States. Often, we have a very myopic approach, right? What we have done is sort of the center or right, good and normal, or, and trying to decenter that, even gesture towards decentering that seemed really important to all of us, and seems, again, still important today. So I think that was, and I think that another thing that we wanted to lift up was, and this became even more crucial as we were working on the project, during the uprising connected to the rebellion, connected to the summer of 2020. It felt really important to lift up these long genealogies, these long histories, this sort of long work that feminists in particular, women of color organizers had been doing around creating safety, around challenging and naming the false promise of safety that the state would offer, right? And building sometimes nascent, sometimes flawed ways to take care of one another, to support one another, when clearly, the state was not doing that work, right? Had no interest in doing that work, and often the state would be the biggest perpetrator of gender and sexual violence, for example, or white supremacy. So it felt really important, and more important after the rebellion of summer 2020, to kind of lift up those histories, to remind people that this moment, that the millions of people suffusing the streets, yelling, defund the police, that the people who've been carrying that work were small grassroots organizations, and internationally, who were doing that kind of proto-abolitionist or abolitionist work, which was about naming forms of violence perpetrated by the state, building alternatives, right? Building other ways to take care of one another, other ways to live, and creating other languages, other sets of relationalities. Because often those histories, in particular, because they were built, those examples or those practices, they were done by, I think of, we have a chapter on Chicago, and I think in the 20 years that I've been here, overlapping a little bit with Connie, wonderfully, has tiny little grassroots initiatives that would be sort of in the dustbin otherwise. So it felt really important to kind of amplify and offer not the history or one history, but a little bit of a mapping of the feminist work that had been ongoing globally, right, for many decades, that was offering kind of abolitionist and proto-abolitionist campaigns and projects. So, and then I'm also just naming centrality, kind of the theme that political education has always been central to that work, right? Teaching and learning and unlearning has always been central to any kind of, proto-abolitionist, feminist abolitionist campaign or project, right? Trying to work with the community, work with ourselves, create opportunities to, as Sabina was saying earlier, both to study and struggle. So that felt really important. And I think, it still feels relevant, and I'm excited about how the project has traveled. I'm excited also about all the conversations that that I have been a part of connected to that project, but also learning. It's so great to even just read on the internet, new examples, or other work that's emerging, that has been ongoing in India, right? Or work that has been going on in South Africa, right? All the work that people have been doing that's not included in our book, but other people are going to create new records or new ways to amplify that work. And I think, yes, we need an internationalist analysis. Yes, we need to think about what's the practice. The book has a heavy emphasis on what people are trying and doing, right? But also what's also the work of, that old term praxis, theory, plus action, plus reflection, is really a central core as well. We want to have a framework about where we want to go, what we want to live, the world that we want to live in, what are the forms of violence that have brought us to that, to echo an earlier point that Connie made. What are we going to try? What's the practice? What are we going to do? And, not everything that we do works, right? Let's be honest, right? But, we know that what we have currently, 40% of the city's operating budget in Chicago on policing is certainly not making the community any stronger and safer. And then what are we going to try to build safety, right? To try to support ourselves and then reflect on that, right? So that praxis framework seems really important. But I want to hear from Connie now about your work, because I have been avidly following your FAB organization, and just love the conversations and the framework that you've been doing. So I'm gonna assume moderator for a second and move to you.
Thanks, Erica. When you were talking, what I was reflecting on is I mentioned earlier that I read both of your works quite a bit when I was in school, as I was preparing to write and think. And to go back to your point, Sabina, when you brilliantly paraphrase what we've been saying around collective study and the importance of it, I don't think it's a luxury. I think study in its multiple forms is a necessity, right? Largely because we've inherited legacies of violence, and we have also, if we do it correctly, inherit legacies of freedom fighting. But that means that we have to study what came before us, what is currently happening, what we want to happen, but we're building in community with those that we are studying. We don't forget that lineage, right? Which I think is important, because when I was in Vietnam just about a month ago, I spent some time studying the war, which helped me to think about war here. And that built on my, I built my ideas and thinking and naming of warfare around Dylan Rodriguez's work around warfare, right? So I studied Dylan's work. All three of you are mentors, friends, family members to me, because I've studied you and I'm now in community with you and thinking with you and fighting alongside you, right? That doesn't mean that we always agree. That means we are building together. And I think that's very important, to go back to the point of collective study. And I have referenced a couple of times, I had the privilege
think Connie may be frozen. Connie, if you can hear us, there we go.
you're back.
Your screen froze for a minute.
Okay.
So where we last heard you, I think, was you said, I've had the privilege
Of archiving Yuri Kochiyama's work. And that was important for a number of reasons. But the reason I bring it today is because the day after Malcolm X died, she went to study group. And I know this because in her notes, she wrote, Brother Malcolm died yesterday. And then she writes all the things that they studied and wrote about and what they were reading, right, subsequently. And so I think about, and these were reading groups that informed her that was a part of her political education, to be a Japanese woman in Harlem who fought for and alongside Puerto Rican independence movements, right? Black liberation movements, fought for the freedoms, up until her death from Mumia Abu-Jamal, Assata Shakur, right? She read and she studied, and I read and I studied her work. Right? And this is where my thinking comes from, because I'm better informed. That also means that all of us here collectively and individually study the world, right? And that isn't necessarily a privilege. It is a necessity to step back and say, what the hell is happening? Right? And I think people take for granted these PhDs behind our names, because some people should really not have them. But that's another conversation. My point is that we studied this hard because we wanted to diagnose the world, right? We are also doctors of a different sort, where we're really trying to study and think through, what is the problem, right? What is the prescription? And then we come together and we're like, y'all, this may be the description together, right? So we think about this collectively to prescribe perhaps a response to the suffering that we are both experiencing and witnessing, that has been centuries long, right? And has its different iterations. And then to address Erica's really kind point, our organization, an organization I co-founded is called AAPI Women Lead. And we've been around for about 5 years. We have a multi-pronged approach to ending racial and gender violence. And the reason I think it's important to bring it up is because our approach is informed by the collective study. It's informed by all the readings and the people and the liberation movements that I named. But you wouldn't know that because on Instagram, we made it real pretty. And I think that's important because we have political education groups that we now call reading groups, right? We have community safety, and that also comes from our histories of and the need for self-defense, right? We have healing and wellness, right?
Connie, we're losing you again.
It's okay.
Froze a couple times.
Did you not hear all the great things I said?
I heard, I think health and wellness and self-defense, and then that's where it froze for me.
I think that's all that I actually really said, but just,
Okay.
just enthusiastically.
Okay.
But to be clear for everyone, that actually comes from the Panthers approach, right? And we did this, it grew exponentially because of the anti-Asian violence, but more importantly, the ways that the violence against Asian Americans in particular and Asian immigrants was being used to discredit abolitionist work. So we came in to reclaim and utilize abolitionist praxis in order to help end racial and gender violence against our communities, but also to stand in solidarity with all movements against anti-Blackness. So I feel like that's all I'm gonna say for now.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And to make a connection, particularly for doctoral students on this call, Erica, you talked about and have talked about before, try, and things might not work, but we keep trying and try collectively and try thoughtfully, not just, but try things. And the sort of the success isn't measured by, do only 2 people show up, or, you know, you've I think provided people with a sense of purpose in the project not having to be perfect to happen. And that's aligned with the sort of always studying. And I think, Connie, you, in some ways, you connected that to how we study and do, because we might try to diagnose a societal problem. And then we might study and we might not agree with our previous diagnosis. And then there's sort of this public failure, right? This public sense of, I tried and it didn't work, but it's now in print forever. And I think that makes people feel, and I'll say to all the doc students, like, I hate half the stuff I've written, it's horrible, I don't agree with it. But we still have to find that, like, find the Erica in you that says, but it's important to, like, where you are right now, don't wait, because if we wait till we think we know, then we'll never write a word. And writing those words pushes conversations forward, even if 5 years later we're like, ooh, I don't agree with that, but it did do something. So there's a sort of way in which I think you both have just offered something to doctoral students, and particularly in this moment, you know, Connie, you said it's all pretty on Instagram. Like, this work isn't pretty, right? It's, you talked about doing the hard work and the messy work and the work that's not always what you hoped it would be, both of you. And so I appreciate that as a model for scholars coming up and how they might think about doing the work. And it's okay if it's not perfect, because it will never be. We have 5 minutes left and no questions yet. So what I'd like to do is ask you just, like, what's next? What's next for you? What do you think is important or exciting or urgent or necessary? You said some of these things, but if there are things you want to add for people on the call, we have particularly, again, educators and doctoral students thinking about what's next.
Okay, Connie's pointing at me. I'm taking direction. I also just want to lift up, I love the frames of your, that you offered, Connie, with the self-defense, wellness. I just want to lean into the kind of wellness and joy. And just kind of echo back to the conversation or the point that Sabina was just making about graduate students, and like find joy, and also, writing into the contradictions. A comrade of mine, a mentor of mine, I have complicated feelings about that word, often told me many years ago, is like, often it's the messiness, the places that are the most messy, that are actually telling us something, right? And that it's not like we're going to solve that messiness, but laying it out sometimes is helpful. Like, and it's also a way to work through that so you can get to the next messy spot. So, and I think the work is for the long haul. I do want to just make one point about the moment that we're in, because I think we're in, the New York Times has had that horrible article, just a couple of days ago about like, the defund movement is like gone. So I think we're in a very predictable movement, a very totally obvious moment of front lash or backlash or white lash, whatever kind of term that we want to use, to the kind of cultural gains that we made during the rebellion, the summer of 2020. And I think the work, is to recognize that and not be and not fall for that, because I think that's an old script for social movements. The backlash, is and I think the depth of the backlash or white lash in this moment, the strength of it is a sign of like how powerful those global uprisings were in the summer of 2020, and how visceral and powerful those demands were, and that street organizing was. So I think it is the moment, especially for those of us that might be newer to this work, to not be like, oh, well, I tried, I marched in 2020 and look, now that we failed, right? Is to sort of remind ourselves that social movements, the ways that social movements unfold is often, very deep and strategic forms of repression. So I think we're in one of those moments right now. And I think it means that we have to sort of, lean back into those containers, those small networks, those 5 people in a community center basement, or like in a tiny room in a mosque maybe, or something like that. Those are the people that we want to, find our people again, regroup, support ourselves, think about the kind of political education work we want to deepen, right? We want to engage in study and struggle. We don't want to, move away from the demands that we've made. We want to, double down on those demands, and we want to own, right? And not be, sort of allow the very predictable script that is unfolding right now to kind of overtake us. So I just want to offer that, because I think that's a reminder that this is long haul work. We've talked about that. This is not like a finish line work. And I also just want to lift up, finding joy, finding wellness, finding community in this work, because I think that's also like an incentive to sort of stay connected and to stay with the work for the long haul. Finding people like Sabina and Connie who bring you joy and also you're nourished by. I think that's really important for being able to do this work, for whatever lifespan that we have the gift to have. So I just want to remind people about that as we close, because I think we're in such an intense moment, even in I'll invoke Illinois, even in Illinois, we're in one of those backlash moments, which is just so predictable. So that's me.
I love that, Erica. I think it is predictable, because if warfare is not an analogy, then that would be why we're so tired, right? That would be why we are injured. And why some of us are fatigued and not well, because it's warfare. And we are not imagining it. It's actually very, very, very real and tangible. And some of it is symbolic, and that too is palatable, right? And so I want to take that very seriously and have us be real with ourselves in that reality, because too many of us are isolated in that knowing, right? We're just tired. Like somehow you're home and you're just tired. Like, why am I so tired? It's like my workload. And that's not it. It's because it's warfare, right? You're taking it from the state. You're taking it from your racist neighbors. You're taking it from your homophobic cousins. You're taking it from the movement people who are actually punks, right? But not in the punk like cool way, but like, you know what I mean? Like infiltrators. And what one of my very good colleagues and friends says, if we are under warfare, you can imagine that almost everyone has the potential to be a counterinsurgent. And if that is the case, then being in warfare and everyone having the possibility of being a counterinsurgent is very tiresome for those of us who are on the front lines. And wellness is essential to coming back out into the front lines again. Because otherwise, the way we're thinking has us constantly in the front lines. And if you don't think of it as an analogy, no wonder, I keep not cursing, but no wonder your ass is effing tired. You know what I mean? So we have to come back, go back to the bunker, go get to the hospital and get your wellness going, because you need to be well and nourished if you're going to come back out. In order for us not to be effective per se, but to live. And for not only movements, but for us to, I feel like saying the word triumph. In Vietnam, they say we sent the US home, right? That's how they celebrate the 30th. We sent the US home. I don't know how we're going to send the US home. This is why we have to collectively study. But we have to regroup occasionally. And really take seriously community defense, community safety, political education, wellness, and collective struggle in order for us to win a war that is ongoing. And then know our parts in each of that in this war. I think that's my kind of my offering, and to echo Erica's point, find your political home. To echo Sabina's point, it's a series of experiments. You don't know what's going to work, but please do make your offerings as an offering, not just coming in here, because I'm experiencing people just cutting people's throats for no reason. So just be well and then join us, you know, or whatever that means. But I'm just saying, just slow down, friends. It's a long struggle.
You all are so fantastic. I just love you. I heard you say regroup, study, take the long view, do the long haul, make decisions about your relations, your role in and against institutions, study warfare, observe the injuries and the fatigue, attend to them in yourselves and each other, recognize the origins of assaults, focus on wellness and community, get well and be nourished in order to come back out and triumph and find our homes and make our offerings. Thank you both. That was just extraordinary. I am so grateful for our hour and a half together.
I love you, Sabina. I love you, Erica.
Oh, just extra gratitude to the translators, because I realized I didn't at all slow down, and I just apologize for that.
Thanks, Derek. Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Chris.
And thanks, Sabina, and Elon for the invitation and all the labor and the work. So, and also just you two for this really nourishing time. Thank you.
Thank you.